Well, we're live, everyone. So we have Daniel Speak, with whom I will be speaking a pun I've now made for the third time.
Keep it rolling.
Yeah. So Daniel Speak, he did an interview with Capturing Christianity about the problem of evil. And so I watched it. I actually had a previous video responding to it. And I thought he'd be an interesting person to chat with. And I was especially the remark at the end of how atheists would be unwilling to chat with him because of his honesty. You know, that made me really want to interview.
Yeah, right.
No, Cameron said that.
Right.
So do you want to present just sort of your, like, the abridged version of your basic response to the problem of evil?
Shoot, Matt, I don't know if I can do that. Is Matthew?
Yeah.
So maybe I'll just say this much. I don't think I could probably do that, in part because I have a view about the problem of evil, along with other, a bunch of other problems in philosophy, but especially in philosophy of religion, that the problem of evil is not the kind of problem that could have a single sort of response, that it's too integrated, and there isn't one thing that the problem of evil hangs on. It actually hangs on a collection of things that might be organized in different ways. So you might have a particular aspect of what I've argued before in mind that I'd be happy to take up more directly. But in general, I think the problem of evil is extremely serious. And that's partly why I'm putting the point out the way I'm putting it, is that I think that very frequently when theists respond to the problem of evil with some single theodicy or some single maneuver, they're not being sufficiently sensitive to just how hard the problem is. So I try not to do that, but I'd be happy to talk through some of the things that I think are relevant to the question, if you had specific things that you had in mind.
Sure. So my understanding, based on the interview you did before, was that basically the line that you adopt is somewhat similar to the skeptical theist line, where you say that based on your priors, you suspect that there is a morally sufficient reason for the evils, even if we don't know what it is.
Good.
Right. So there are a couple of worries that I have for the skeptical theist route. So one of them would be that
I've got worries about the skeptical theist route too, Matthew, just so you know. So good. So okay. Hit me with it. Yeah.
Yeah. So one of those worries is the evil God challenge that was raised by Stephen Law. It seems like if we take the skeptical theist line and say that there can be a morally sufficient reason for all of the world's evils, that does not rule out this being an optimally designed world by a perfect God, and it seems like we could similarly think that this is the worst possible world that could be designed by a maximally evil deity. And yet it seems like the problem of good does rule out a maximally evil deity. And so it seems like if we adopt too skeptical of a line, then that opens us up to the possibility of not being able to infer anything about God, even that God is good at all.
Nice. I see. Good. Well, this does dovetail with a thing I do feel I have felt. I don't know this particular claim about the evil God problem, but the way you just set it out strikes me as quite interesting. And it does connect to a view I have had and have tried to express that gives me pause about skeptical theism. One of the reasons that I've got my worries about skeptical theism, parenthesis, I've got my worries about it. I also think there's something to it. So we probably need to get used to this together, Matthew, that I think that in some respects, I'm kind of an annoying guest, right? Because in one sense, a lot of the things that you're going to raise as responses to atheism, I'm probably going to say, that's got a lot going for it. That's plausible. Here's the nuanced view that's like right on the edge that leads me away from it. But I'm not going to be saying, that's dumb. Here's the right answer. So with respect to skeptical theism, though I have some impulses in the direction of thinking that something's right there, my own resistances have come from this kind of case. See if you think it's connected to the law point. It looks to me like the skeptical theistic response works just as well if the world were much, much shittier than it actually is, right? So imagine, the way I've sometimes thought of it is, imagine, call it excruciating world, that the world was just the only sentient creatures that came into existence for 20 minutes. And the entire time that they existed, they were in excruciating pain, like on the order of giving, breech childbirth without anesthesia. And then they passed out of existence. And that was it. 20 minutes of sheer pain. That's it. They're out of existence. Now, my temptation is to think, if the distributions of pain in the universe were like that, that would be pretty good evidence there was no God. But as you're noting, Matthew, and as I think it's a consequence of the way that the law argument's going, or at least your application of it is going, consider excruciating world. You might think that the skeptical theism is going to work just as well at that world, right? I mean, you might still think that even as I'm attracted to the claim that distribution would be good evidence that there was no God. You can imagine the stringent skeptical theist saying, "But Dan, for all you know, there are reasons that God has for allowing excruciating world that are beyond your ken, right? So take a deep breath and let it go." And I'm just noting, like, that's a bridge too far for me, right? So when skeptical theism gets put to those last trumps, it seems to me something's gone wrong with it. So you might ask, go ahead, Matthew. You don't need me to ask the question for myself.
Well, so I mean, so then, I guess I am broadly
still attracted to skeptical theism,
right? Yeah, no, I mean, the line of thought that you just laid out, I think, is actually quite a good objection to skeptical theism.
Here's the way I would put it. I do think it's a powerful objection. It's why I can't go all in on skeptical theism. Why do I still go partway in on skeptical theism? We'll zoom back a step. When I think about skeptical theism as, abstracted away from the problem of evil and just considering the question, suppose there were a being like the God that say, some version of Christianity describes. And you ask about that being. If that being existed, how likely is it, Dan, that you would be able to appreciate that being's reasons for doing anything, right? And my response to that question, totally independently of the question about evil, right, just as a conditional upon the question of this God's existence, how likely is it I'd know or be able to appreciate that being's reasons for doing anything, making the world, setting it up a certain way? My judgment on that is a shoulder shrug. Like, I don't think I have, like, I understand some of the things. Maybe, I mean, if the being wants to make a world and wants to make creatures like me, there's probably some of the things I know. How much of it would I be able to know and appreciate? And there, I really do. I find myself shrugging. And so what I'm tempted to think is that when skeptical theism is at its best, it's an expression of epistemic humility that seems to me everyone should have, not just the theist. I mean, take someone who's not a theist, take Matthew, who's not a theist. And I think that you should judge that the question, well, how likely is it, Matthew, that if God existed, we'd be in position to appreciate that being's reasons for doing various things? I think you should have the same epistemic humility as me. Like, I don't have any good judgment about that. So when I'm thinking about the skeptical theism from that point of view, I actually find that a kind of plausible epistemic humility. Then you press it all the way to the end to excruciating world, and I think, oh, it's gone too far. Now it seems to me, here's the question. Is our ordinary circumstance with the evils that we find and the goods, right, such that we ought to be worried about excruciating world? I think, well, we ought to be worried about it in the sense that we should see that skeptical theism can't solve every problem. But it turns out, right, that the world isn't excruciating world. That isn't the way the pains and pleasures are distributed in this world. We might have lots of concerns about how they are distributed, and I recognize forms of argument that turn on that. But since the world's not quite like that, it doesn't seem to me that it's quite as problematic to rely on the epistemic humility that we started with, that had its purchase independently of the question of the evils in the world. And so what I think is that there's a kind of dynamic relationship between how plausible the skeptical theist claims are and what the world's actually like. Just how bad is the world? So that strikes me as a kind of delicate balance that the skeptical theist ought to take seriously. And so I don't go all the way in on the skeptical theism in that regard.
Yeah. So I think that in terms of that response, so I think that while that, maybe you think that we can't have very confident predictions about what God's particular desires would be, and I think that that belief is somewhat reasonable. But there do seem to be certain instances of evil that seem to be as obviously gratuitous as the entire world, where it's just purely people being born, immense agony, and then disappearing. So, like, if you asked me, like, okay, which one do I think is more likely to have a morally sufficient reason for its existence? With option one being like, the fact that, like, when people are starving to death, they experience as much agony as they do, that their agony isn't lessened even a little bit, or that that there would be a morally sufficient reason for a perfect being to bring about the hell world that you described. I don't actually like my confidence in those things being bad and there not being a morally sufficient reason for those two examples of evil is roughly comparable. And so I think that even if we go the line of saying that that the entire world is sufficiently ambiguous that it is not far enough in the red, so to speak, to rule out a perfect God, there seem to be features of the world that seem to be sufficiently gratuitously evil that they do seem to rule out a perfect God.
Nice, good, Matthew. Let me say two things to that. I think it's going to be two things. Let's see how it goes. I mean, the first thing is, maybe it's three things. So the first thing is, yeah, if that's your judgment about the instances that look like gratuitous evils, like the one you're considering here with hunger, and that looks to you as gratuitous as excruciating world looks to me, then I think you're right that skeptical theism isn't going to be any help to you. Okay, and so you're going to have the full force of the evidential concern there. And so then the second thing is a kind of gesture in that direction that like that I don't think what you're saying is batshit crazy, is to say you might notice this. You might know this, Matthew, that in Richard Swinburne's work, he's sometimes said in Providence of the Problem of Evil, he takes note of the idea that he thinks that there are experiences of evil that he thinks people ought to experience as gratuitous unless they're given a defeater for it. So he thinks something that's quite not far away from what you're noting, right? That he thinks it would be defective for some people to see some evils and not think they're gratuitous, and then he thinks that's why he needs something like a theodicy to try to undercut, to be a defeater for those things. I'm not sure I agree with him about this. By the way, I mean, one thing to say about it is, I don't know if I can say it all without getting me in more trouble than I'm already in. So I'll go on to the next thing, which is, so that's got something going for it. How come
now I'm very curious as to what it was.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll put it. Here's the thing I was going to say. I mean, a lot turns on a issue in epistemology that Swinburne has made up his mind about, and it's not a crazy way to make up your mind, right? He thinks that a fundamental feature of all of our knowing or being justified is something like how things seem to us. Like how things seem to us makes them prima facie rational for us to believe, unless we get defeaters, right? And then he thinks it will seem to us as if this evil is gratuitous, right? And that seeming grounds, it would be rational for you to think it's gratuitous unless you get the defeater. And I guess the thing I was going to say that might get me in more trouble is, bless you. is
that was someone from the other room.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, you didn't look like your head moved, so yeah, that's right. So here's the way I would put it. Though I'm attracted to the epistemology that Swinburne discusses there and that he lays out, I'm not quite as all in on it as he is. And it's because it does seem to me that there are some forms of seeming, like if I say it seems to me that there's a cup in my hand, so I'm at least prima facie epistemically justified in believing there's a cup in my hand, that seems like that's got a lot going for it, right? But suppose I say this, it seems to me that the existence of this cup is incompatible with materialism. And then I've got I tell you some story about how that seems. Suppose I think, like, or maybe more plausibly, I don't know how much your listeners know about philosophy. So should I assume, Matthew, that they know some philosophy? I mean,
yeah, I think that they probably know a decent.
Okay, good. Then here's the thing I was gonna say. If it's one thing for me to say, it seems to me that this there's a cup in my hand, so probably there is one. How about it seems to me that there's the cup being in my hand is incompatible with idealism. It's incompatible with the idea that the only things that fundamentally exist are ideas. Well, I don't think that's seeming. If someone reports that seeming to me about the mug, I'm like, I'm not inclined to give that very much credence in their epistemology. It seems that seeming has something built into it that's more like an analysis and less like a direct seeming, right? And so now with that thought in mind, go back to the Swinburnian point, and now to your point about your experience of the gratuitous evils. It's not obvious to me that what it would mean for there to be a seeming as if this evil is gratuitous. That is, I don't think I can just, because think about what it is for it to be gratuitous. For it to be gratuitous is for it to be the kind of thing that an omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent being has no good reason to permit. And it already seems to me to be like suspicious that I could just see that an evil was like that. Now, again, this might get me in trouble because you might say, but Dan, didn't you say in the case of excruciating world? I'm not saying that I can just see that excruciating world is gratuitous. I'm saying, taking the total package of things, I have a hard time understanding how that could be something that strikes me as very good evidence that there wouldn't be a God. Can I just see that it's gratuitous? Can you just see that the situation with respect to starvation is a gratuitous evil? That's the part that I'm in more doubt about, but it's already being funded by my skeptical theism a little bit here. And now let me just push that this way.
Yeah, well, so on that point, so I would agree that, I don't think that we can, so I would adopt something sort of like Hume's principle of phenomenal conservatism.
Good.
So
good.
I think
I'm attracted to it too. So good.
Yeah. So I think that if X seems to be the case, that gives us at least prima facie justification for thinking that it is the case. Now, so it might be the case. So, I think that lots of seemings will, can be defeated. So if a person says it seems like the fact that it seems like there's a cup defeats idealism, I don't think that that's going to be very good evidence, because it seeming that way is just as strongly predicted on idealism as on physicalism, or on non-idealism.
Yeah. No.
But in the case of evils like starvation, parasites, etc., the fact that we've been for like thousands of years trying to figure out a justification for all the world's evils. And it's like it's not even clear that we've been able to nail down one evil that like clearly God has a morally sufficient reason for allowing. Well, I mean, maybe it would depend on how we cash out evil. I think means that if it were the case that there was truly a morally sufficient reason for evil, it would probably seem to us that there was a morally sufficient reason for evil.
Interesting. Given the amount of time or something like that and effort.
Right. I mean, yeah, much like, I think that if the original version of string theory were true, the fact that so much research was poured into it and the results it produced, like the original most simple version, turned out to be false, we would probably expect to have discovered that it was true. And so I think similarly, if you have people like Swinburne in Plantinga, who are some of the smartest people around, thinking really hard about whether or not there's a morally sufficient reason for instances of evil, and I mean, they think that they have some decent theodicies. I don't think that those tend to be very successful. But we would expect that some of the smartest minds on earth would be able to figure out that there's a morally sufficient reason for at least some of the evils, if it were the case that not only some, but all of the evils have a morally sufficient reason for their existence.
You don't think we have? You don't think we've come up with morally sufficient reason for any of the evils?
Well, so it would depend on what. So it would depend on what we mean by any of the evils. So like, well, I mean, I think so. This will get into some deeper questions, but I do think that there are successful versions of the logical problem of evil. But I think that the logical problem of evil is less like the logical problem of evil is harder to defend than the evidentiary problem of evil.
Yeah.
And so I tend to generally stick to the evidentiary or evidential problem of evil.
Yeah. Good.
But it's also I'm a hedonic utilitarian, so I think that from a hedonic utilitarianism, I think it just would follow fairly straightforwardly that a perfect being would just create infinite desirable mental states and no suffering. But like the plausibility of the problem of evil, I think that the plausibility of any particular view in normative ethics is probably going to be less persuasive than just the problem of evil generally. So but so that would get into a deeper question. But I generally think maybe there was the free will theodicy. I think maybe works to explain some evils, but I think that the at least the vast majority of evils have not been explained, particularly natural evils.
Well, we can think more about that. I think that it's super interesting, Matthew, to take note of the way that your moral commitments there play a role. This is why, by the way, when I started saying, look, I don't think there's one thing that's a response to this, you start to see pretty clearly, right, that how one feels the force of and considers the possible responses to the problem of evil will be quite deeply informed by some fundamental questions in ethics and value theory, where it looks to me like we would have very different intuitions about those things, quite independently, I think, of the question of God's existence. We would, and I say quite independently. Maybe it turns out it's not totally independently of that, but at least we could imagine just talking about hedonic utilitarianism and its alternatives, and we would, we would disagree pretty pointedly there. And no surprise that it's going to turn out that things that strike me as having at least some evils that strike me as having a minimally plausible justification available to us for them from the theistic perspective will strike you as not being at all plausible, given that picture of morality. So that's worth noting. Let me try this other thing, just to have it on the table in light of your good challenge about just take the case of the suffering from hunger and starvation, right? And your point is that looks to you to be as gratuitously evil as my excruciating world. Part of why that hasn't gripped me yet isn't because I think I have a really good answer to the question of why there is the phenomenon you describe. I'm trusting you that the phenomenon you describe is in fact a phenomenon. I don't know enough about the actual, biology of the situation, but I'm sure you do. So let's grant that. Maybe this is a decent point to put this in, that, and I said some of this in that interview with Cameron, so this can just be fuel for you, kicking my butt around about that too. That part of the reason I'm not as impressed on that score is that I can be at least minimally attracted to a broader kind of modal skepticism, right? A broader kind of skepticism about our ability to make judgments about possibility and necessity when they're a long ways away from the mechanisms that we would have been endowed with by the Darwinian structures. So consider this question that I think is probably built into the way you're thinking of the intuitive ugliness of the suffering that you're thinking of with the hunger. Here's a natural thought. Well, God could have made the laws of nature such that people had appetites and got hungry in ordinary circumstances in such a way that they fed themselves and flourished and were able to, under normal circumstances with the availability of food. But when food got scarce enough and appetites got serious enough, that kicked off or something, or wasn't as painful or what have you. And all I want to note about that is, while I can feel in some respects the kind of intuitive idea of that possibility, I also feel some impulse to point out that if I were a naturalist like you, I might think, well, the only grounds I could have for trusting my modal judgments would be that they were given to me by my Darwinian lineage. And then I would find myself wondering why my Darwinian lineage would give me capacities to be able to make modal judgments about what the world would have been like if it had different natural laws, or that they could have had different natural laws, or various things like that. And there I find myself in this naturalistic spirit. It seems to me my attitude should probably be, I don't really have much sense of what things would be like under different. I don't really know if the world could have been different. Could the world have been such that we had high level functioning creatures with capacities like ours that developed through a process of evolution, but that had the mechanism that Matthew wants them to have, namely something like, well, when the hunger gets to a place where you're not going to be able to get any food, and so you're going to die, the pain kicks off. I just find myself genuinely at a loss with respect to whether or not such a thing is possible and what the laws of nature would have to be like to make them so. So, and that seems like a case where, notice, this sort of skeptical impulse is not just a broad skeptical impulse, like who knows what God's reasons are. It's slightly more connected to our capacities, right? And to the limitations of our capacities, given what we know about how we came to have them.
Sure. So I would make a few points. So
yeah, please. Yeah.
One would be that I think that the problem of evil can be just run as an internal critique. And so at that point, it becomes hard to explain why God would make our faculties for coming to modal judgments, especially modal judgments in particular ways that lead many people to doubt that he exists at all. Why would he would make them to be not only unreliable, but unreliable in particular ways, which often lead people away from God, namely that people become uncertain of exactly how God would have a morally sufficient reason for evil. I also think that this would be both susceptible to the evil God challenge. So you might say that, this is the worst possible world, and the evil God, maybe he couldn't have done things differently to make things maximally horrible. And then the final point that I'd make is that I think that there is a plausible naturalistic story to be told about how we would get this. That's relatively similar to the story about how we, are able to do calculus, namely that through evolution, we evolved the ability to reason pretty effectively, and reasoning pretty effectively. Doing calculus was not directly beneficial to our survival, but it had ancillary benefits, including good modal judgments and being able to do calculus. Yeah. At least for some people. I can't do calculus very well. So.
Yeah, exactly. I'm with you on that, but I take the point. But in a way that, look, I'm not as modally skeptical as say Peter Van Inwagen sounds like he is. But the reason I'm not modally skeptical as he is because I'm a theist. So I find it plausible that God would have a reason to endow us with capacities, even if the processes were through the evolutionary mechanisms, such that eventually these creatures would be capable of making some pretty high-powered modal judgments. Right? The thing I was feeling, back to your point about internal critique, is that strikes me as a harder position for the non-theist or for the naturalist to get into. Now, your point about calculus is the good one. It's just that it does look like we have to think that our ability to do calculus is like a spandrel, right? There's some respect in which there was some other thing that it was good for creatures like us to have that was functionally useful to us in the 4Fs. And then it turned out that that writing on that was the ability to do calculus. And I'm not saying that couldn't be how it goes with respect to our more modal judgments. I'm just noting it looks like we'll have gotten very lucky, right? And so we have a question about whether or not we should be confident in the luck with respect to that. Now you might say, well, with respect to calculus, we can be pretty confident about it because we have ways of checking that we're pretty good at this. That's true, but does that give us grounds for thinking that our modal judgments about, say, what the things would have happened if the world had different natural laws? If you compare two worlds, one with another with this set of laws, which one would be better in these regards? Whether or not, for example, it was possible for a being like God to produce creatures like us through the process of evolution, that itself, but ended up in the way that you wanted to end up, such that people don't suffer from hunger in the way that they do. And about that, I think even with the success of calculus, I don't find myself with strong grounds when I have my naturalistic hat on for thinking I would have the capacities for that. And so I think I ought to be in doubt about that. And then let me just note, I don't think I'm getting to everything you were nicely bringing out there. I don't know enough about that evil God view to respond to it, but it does seem cool, the thing you're noting about that. So maybe we can pursue that more. But the first point you made was about, why would God not let us give us the kinds of the evolutionary mechanisms that would allow us to make the kinds of modal judgments that would at least insulate people from certain kinds of doubt about God? I mean, after all, these kinds of things do lead people astray. I actually, this sort of edges us into the problem of divine hiddenness in certain ways, but I'll just say I don't actually on theism, at least on the brand of theism that I'm inclined to think is most plausible, I'm not that surprised that there are people who doubt. For example, I'm not surprised about your doubt. I don't like my experience of you, Matthew, is not you're not resisting evidence. You're not fighting, aimlessly to stop yourself from being under the authority of a divine figure. You're intelligently trying to weigh the pros and cons of the views and reach a conclusion about these things. And then here's the maybe what I guess some people would find surprising is that I find it plausible that what God, if God exists, would want from creatures like us is for us to work this shit out and to use the capacities which we have. And if people are going to seriously use the capacities that they have and try to work these things out, the world's going to have some ambiguities in it, and thoughtful, fair-minded people are going to come to different conclusions over time, and we're going to have to continue to work them out together. And all of that kind of work together is intrinsically good and a feature of becoming the kinds of things that I take it that God would have us be. So I don't find it that surprising that there would be the kinds of doubting, even at the quite fundamental level, that we find. Notice, I'm not saying that makes it good. I recognize how uncomfortable and painful that is. I go through that myself, and I'm not wishing it on anyone. I'm just saying it looks to me like there are goods in the neighborhood of this that strike me as reasonably pursuable by a maximally good being, and they would have as a consequence that lots of people would find themselves in serious doubt about things.
Sure. So I think that the point about how God would want us to work through those problems is an interesting one. But so one point is that I think that if that were true, then you would expect the best argument that was available to be to not be sort of a basic form of the skeptical theist line, because the skeptical theist route, it does sort of seem like a little bit of a cop-out if God's aim is to allow us to discover the purpose of evil. To the extent that the thing we discover is, we don't know what it is, but there is something. Well, that doesn't seem to be a very good explanation at all for why there's evil. And I also don't know if this is able to explain why our faculties for modal reasoning would be unreliable. Given that, to the extent that they're unreliable, then that makes it harder to figure out why God would have a morally sufficient reason for it, rather than easier. And so, it would be like saying that God wants us to struggle through math problems while not allowing most people to be able to do addition intuitively.
Yeah, good. Nice. These are two nice points. I mean, I don't know, Matthew. The way I'm tempted to put it is, I don't know. I don't think I have anything good to say other than look, I don't think what you're saying is crazy by any means. I don't think that, but yeah, I guess I'll say this much. My own version of skeptical theism, which is already, constrained in certain respects. Part of its constraint is that it does still seem to me so important that creatures like us engage in serious reflection, and that on my version of the story, some part of it is God's desire for human beings to develop rationally and morally and what have you, in all of those ways. And that a certain amount of play in the system, a certain amount of uncertainty, a certain amount of those things are required for creatures like us to become the kinds of things that God would want us to be. And it's partly for that reason that that's another reason why I'm not totally satisfied with skeptical theism, because I agree with you. Some people do use it as a kind of block against thinking these things through. I don't want to do that. And here's one way to put the point, is that I'm committed to a form of skeptical theism that does not eliminate the relevance of trying to do theodicy, right? Hear me on this. I don't think we have anything that's like a knockdown successful theodicy yet. And I hear you when you say, well, not yet. Well, when are we getting it? I don't know. Again, my view is we have made incremental progress. I do think the free will defense and the free will theodicy go some distance, and I think that soul making goes some distance. I think and I think that concerns about natural laws go some distance. So I think we make some progress along those lines, and I think that it's incumbent upon us, given the kind of theism that I endorse, it's incumbent upon us to keep thinking those things through. We can't use skeptical theism as a block to say, let's get better, let's figure out, let's learn more. I mean, we need to know a lot more about human beings at the neural level and about other animals at the neural level. We need to know about pain. We need to know about its development. We need to know about its distribution. All of those things are still to be worked out and learned, and constructing the idea of I still think it's a worthwhile project to keep working on the theodicy. The skeptical theism point is just like, but look, I mean, I should be epistemically humble about how that goes. I shouldn't be surprised if it turns out that I hit the edges of my understanding. And then have I hit the edges of my understanding in such a way that it's more like excruciating world, or more like, what I think of is the actual situation, which, like, look, there's a lot of good in the world. And then there are things that are absolutely first rate, transparently shitty in the full on horror sense. And the question is, okay, so why are those in the system? And I'm trying to think about how they go. But I do note that I don't think I should be surprised if about some of these things I haven't yet been able to come to it. But I don't think from that it follows that I shouldn't be trying to do that. And I'm not surprised that a world overseen by God would contain a lot of open questions about these things. So I don't feel the force of the point you were making, I think, initially, that if what I was saying was right, that skeptical theism wouldn't be the answer. I was like, well, it wouldn't be the only answer. There would still be things to search out. And I myself think of myself as still trying to figure those things out. And I hope others are too. People smarter than me, thankfully, right?
Sure. So So one other point that I was thinking about was,
I think I missed one of your points in there, but we can come back if you see it and you want to attract it.
No, I think you covered it all. So one other point that I was thinking about earlier when you brought up the example of hell world, we can call it, is that, that, like, if we think about all sentient beings, that does not seem to be too far off from this world, and certainly and much more so from this world if we go back throughout history. So the vast majority of beings are born to species that are what are called R-strategists, which means that they have vast numbers of offspring, very few of whom will survive. And so, for example, like salmon lay like something like 5,000 eggs, tuna lay 10 million eggs. And so,
what was that? Tuna laid 10 million?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And only 2 of them per parent will survive to reproduce. And so just something like 99.9999% of sentient beings that are ever born will just die at a very young age, certainly before ever reaching reproductive age. But many of them will die either from like the egg not hatching properly, will die while still in the egg, will
preyed upon. Yeah.
Right. And so I think the median life of a sentient being on this planet seems to be quite a bit like the median life on in hell world that you described. Now, while it's true that this world has several billion beings, most of whom live pretty good lives, it's more if we count wild animals, it still seems like the vast majority of the sentient beings just die after an incredibly short period of time, often in very painful ways.
Good. And keep in mind, Matthew, I don't want to try to look away from that. Okay. I want to, I hope that in my conversation that you saw with Cameron, you saw me trying to take that seriously and being kind of pissed off at theists who've not taken those things seriously enough. That said, part of what I think gives excruciating world, as I was describing it, it's distinctively conditional evidential force is that I was imagining it as 20 minutes of excruciating pain, and then non-existence, right? And I think there's still a deep problem about what you might describe in your cases. You might be described as wastefulness of the Darwinian mechanisms, right? I mean, lots of species survive by, just shotgunning it out there and hoping that enough of it lasts. And that can seem extremely wasteful from a certain kind of point of view where we're concerned about simple sentience, for example. But I was thinking that what was giving excruciating world its special timbre was the excruciating part. And so that's why I would say, well, it doesn't seem to me like the actual world is much like excruciating world in that way. Yes, there are a lot of creatures that have very short lives. There are even a lot of creatures that suffer, right? But and I think the existence of both of those features has to be faced by theism, but it's not quite like facing excruciating world. At least on my view, it's not that every sentient creature, including intelligent ones, suffer in this excruciating way and then pass out of existence. I mean, and note, for example, that at least. It's important. I don't go ahead. Sorry. If I say more, I'll go into deeper trouble. So if I have to get into deeper trouble, so be it.
Well, so I think that there are obviously differences between this world and excruciating world, and I think that the problem of evil in excruciating world would be considerably stronger than it is in this world.
Good. I think we agree on that. Yeah.
Yeah, partly because no one would have time to think of any good theodicies because they're all gone in 20 minutes.
That's exactly right.
And it even takes Plantinga like 30 minutes to come up with brilliant theodicies. So
yeah, I don't think it takes Alex Pruss that long. I think Alex Proust can like cook something up in like a minute and a half. But yeah, fair enough.
Yeah. So Alex Proust, he would just be the only ones who have any theodicies in that world.
You better hope that he was one of the ones born. That's exactly right.
Yeah. But I think that if we think about this world, the lives of well above 99% of sentient beings are sort of similar to that of those in excruciating world, with the exception of, on average, probably they live a little bit longer. But so rather than 20 minutes, like hours, and maybe their death is a little bit less pain, but I mean, it's not even clear that the average death is less painful. So like a death from starvation, suffocation, or predation all seem to be sort of roughly comparable to life in excruciating pain world. And so the worlds aren't exactly the same. Like the world, as I see it, it's sort of like something roughly similar to excruciating world for like 99% of sentient beings, well above that. And then there are some beings who are intelligent and they're able to progress and do cool things. But I think that if we had excruciating world where 0.001% of the beings that were born, we can modify it in two ways. One, we make them much less intelligent on average and probably have less great capacity for suffering, but they still suffer greatly. And second, we make 0.001% of, or 0.0001% of the beings that are born be intelligent and then survive and generally live minimally okay lives, albeit, many of them still die at a young age. And there do seem to be suffering that at least appears gratuitous that inflicts many of them. I mean, one thing that seems to have, this seems to have in common with gratuitous misery world is, I think that, like, if I had to bet right now as to whether there's more total happiness or suffering in the world, I would bet that there's probably more suffering in the world if we take into account the plight of animals. And that, that maybe there's a morally sufficient reason for some evil, but more misery than well-being just seems immensely implausible on theism.
So yeah, it's good. I don't know what to make of the. I'm trying to look inside myself here about the judgment. Is there more misery than flourishing among the sentient creatures that our planet supports?
Now, just to note, if I had to predict on average throughout the entire history of the world, including the future, I would estimate that would be positive, because I think that there are opportunities for, human civilization has amazing opportunities for bringing about really, really great scenarios. So, I've previously talked about why I think reducing existential threats should be one of the top global priorities. So I think that the gentleman I gave doesn't implicate that in any way.
Yeah, I see. Good. Well, I don't know. I don't think I'm in a good. One of the possibilities here is that my pernicious theism is already poisoning my careful thinking here. But it's when I find myself thinking about the range of sentience throughout natural history, I guess my mind, maybe my mind inaccurately goes to all those families of animals that have been born and raised and showed some kind of minimal care for each other, and all of the fish in the ocean long before human beings were around that lived out pretty reasonable fish lives, other than the predation. And sure, lots of eggs were lost, but none of them were, I shouldn't say none of them. The ones that made it did pretty well for fish lives and ecosystems, etc. And like, I feel like I don't know how to do this math, to be honest with you, Matthew. I really don't. But and then I guess I also want to just at least, I don't want to wonder that. Again, you'll jump all over it. So I guess I'm just reporting. I don't know. the idea that upon reflection on the history of the natural world, you clearly come to the conclusion that there's been more misery than flourishing. I don't feel that yet.
Sure. So so I'm not especially confident in that judgment. I'd say I'd give it about 85% odds.
Yeah, interesting.
But I mean, so I think that one relevant point is that to the extent that it's a open question whether there's more misery than flourishing, like it seems like if the world were designed by an absolutely perfect being, it would be decisive.
It'd be decisive.
Right? But then the second point is, so I mean, while it's true that there will be lots of sentient beings who live pretty good lives, there are just many more who live short lives of intense suffering. So what Oscar Horta looked at in a paper that he did about this was, so he assumed that for tuna, he assumed that of the ones that were born, they experienced 10 seconds of agony before death. And so he looked at, okay, for each adult tuna who survives to reproduce, how many years of suffering are experienced? And I think it was something like where the suffering being included is just the 10 seconds before death. So that's very conservative. Starvation before death leads to a lot more than 10 seconds of suffering. Predation often takes several minutes. But even if we say it's just the 10 seconds, well, it's something like 6,000 years of suffering for every.
I see.
Right. For every tuna that lives to be the age to reproduce. And so while there may be one who lives on and has a nice tuna life, and that's supplanted by 6,000 or 5,000, I forget which one, years of just excruciating pain by very conservative estimates.
Yeah. You use the term agony there. Are we talking about what are the initial spawn of tuna called?
I'm not sure.
Fingerlings or something like that. It's about having 10 seconds of agony.
I don't remember. I'm pretty sure that he just looked at the percent. He estimated what percentage of them he thought would become sentient at some point. And then he took that into account. Now, I mean, that's obviously going to be somewhat imprecise.
Yeah,
but
sure. I don't know, Matthew. You're right to press me on this, because you have me on the horns of a little dilemma that I don't know what my impulses ought to be about this dilemma. Right. On the one hand, as you've heard me say, and I want to continue to insist, I think the problem of animal suffering is a real problem, and that theists shouldn't look away from it and pretend it doesn't exist, etc. And furthermore, I think that theists in particular have had a tendency not just to look away from the problem of animal suffering, but also to minimize the seriousness of each animal's suffering. So now that's the one side. On the other side, I have to confess to feeling, this is someone who feels the concern for vegetarian arguments and for vegan arguments, or what have you, but that nevertheless, it seems to me, and maybe you're granting this, that there's something like a seriousness of the capacity for suffering that increases with certain kinds of capacities, and that and maybe I'm being too. This happens to me, by the way, in conversations with. This happened to me once when I was trying to decide whether or not I was kind of pescatarian for a while. I was trying to not eat any mammals, and a person sort of challenged me about fish, and my response to them was like, I'm having a hard. You're going to talk me out of this, Matthew. I know it, but I'm having a hard time. I'm not denying that fish have pain. It feels a little off to describe them as in agony, right? And I think it's because there might be a way in which I conceptualize agony as having a kind of cognitive content that I can't really get my mind on fish having. So now you see the horns of my dilemma, right? The dilemma is, on the one hand, I don't want to look away from the problem. I don't want to minimize it. I don't want to minimize animal suffering. On the other hand, if I'm being honest with you, I have to say I don't feel the force of the particulars that I think you're describing with tuna, because I'm not feeling the idea of their agony maybe as much as I should. So you want to talk me into feeling that more? Yeah.
Well, so a couple of things. So one would be that, even if you think that it's not agony, presumably it's at least somewhat bad, right? When they're in pain. And so the fact that it's going on for, so there are probably quadrillions of fish. So the fact that it's going on for, I don't know how many offspring fish have on average, but for some number way more than a quadrillion, and a quadrillion is already, more than the number of humans multiplied by the number of humans. So more than an entire human race per human. Or wait, maybe it's not. I don't. Wait, I think that would be like 49.
As long as you say it confidently, Matthew, I'll accept it. So
yeah, it's a big number. So even if it doesn't matter as much, it still seems like just the sheer number of beings to whom who are suffering in that way makes it extremely morally significant. I also think that it's not clear why we would think so. I think there are certain elements of suffering that are made worse by being robust cognitively. So one of them is it probably does make the suffering more intense, given that we just have more neurons, so our mental life is much richer. One of them is that for us, we can if when a person is dying, they can sort of confront the horrific tragedy and think to all their plans. Seems like fish probably can't do that.
Yeah.
But I think that just in their capacity to suffer, if we think about just imagine being eaten by a school of piranhas. A small part of that being bad relates to all your future plans that you're losing out on. But just the biggest reason why that's bad is because it's just
it hurts.
It's so immensely painful in a way that maybe fish can't feel it as intensely as we can. But it's certainly not fun for them. And so I think that even if we don't call it agony, it's still a really big problem. And I think that we should call it agony.
Yeah.
Just based on sort of what the experience is qualitatively like.
Yeah, good. You saw how tentative I was trying to be about it, because I don't want to be dismissive of it, in part because I don't think I have access to fish suffering, right? So we have to do it on the basis of studying fish neurology and fish behavior and what have you, and when friends have pressed me about these views, it's not like I'm not ignoring this. I think that I have to take this seriously. So what's going on then? I mean, I think it's something like, this will be an unattractive thing, right? I hate you, Matthew, for making me reveal parts of myself in these ways. Look, there is. I think I'm just going to throw myself back on the. I don't think I. You want to take that data, the data of all of that, call it, historic animal suffering, and you want to fairly confidently judge that if there were a God like the one that theism announces, that things wouldn't be like that. And it's not as if I don't feel the force of it, but yes, this is probably where the skeptical hypotheses do find themselves kicking in for me, where I find myself thinking, that's just not so obvious to me. Like it when I think about what it would take to get creatures like us in the way that we came about, when I think about the goodnesses in a universe like ours that don't have anything to do with biological life on this planet, that just have to do with the beauties of the Crab Nebula and how the laws of nature work, and what fills up the expanses between galaxies that have their own beauties and what have you, and the idea that somehow out of that, there was a way to get all of that, but also including us and including the things that from my point of view, God would reasonably want from creatures like us and our aims. And he could have done all of that, but not had the shotgun tuna experience, or not had the suffering, the particular form of suffering that comes from hunger at the end of a person or a creature that starves. That is where I find myself thinking, how likely is it that God could have done that? I don't have any idea. I think you have more confidence, right, that God could have done those things if God has the properties that theism claims, and I don't have that confidence.
Yeah. So I mean, given that so I mean, this sort of gets us back a bit to the skeptical theism route, and so this might be a good time to present another objection to skeptical theism, which is also comes from Stephen Law, which is the Pandora's box objection. So the basic objection is that, so if we think that God has a morally sufficient reason for all of the evils in the world, even ones that seem obviously gratuitous, if we have a reason to think that those are not in fact gratuitous, think there are lots of things that seem gratuitous, but apparently God has morally sufficient reason for them. Then this seems to open up a Pandora's box of possible other things that God could do. So if God can have a morally sufficient reason for producing malaria, or flesh-eating parasites, or just all the suffering in the world, then it doesn't seem implausible to say that God could have a morally sufficient reason for lying to us, or to force us to undergo 3,500 years of the subjective experience of being engulfed by flames before entering heaven, or just any number of other things. So if you go the skeptical theist route and say that we can't really ascertain what God's reasons for doing things could be, then that if you say that God's reasons for taking moral actions are unpredictable, then you run the problem that if they're unpredictable, we can't predict them. And so it opens up a Pandora's box of just lots of things that they could be.
It does seem like the right inference to draw. Yeah, good.
Yeah.
If they're unpredictable, then they can't be predicted. Nice. Well, and I don't know this one in particular, but you've set it out nicely here, so I'll try to respond to it. It does bear certain resemblances to other complaints that people have made about skeptical theism so I'll say what I've been tempted to say to those, and let's see if it lands at all. I mean, one thing to note is this won't land for you very well, right? Because your moral view won't tolerate it that much. But at least it's not implausible for folks who are not hedonic utilitarians, for anybody who's got any kind of impulse towards deontic constraints in morality. That is, anybody who thinks that there can be moral demands that cannot be trumped by consequences, right? There can be some like that. That if anything like any deontic constraints on morality were true, and God's a moral being, then it might be that even though, I don't know, malaria can come into existence, right? Most theists won't think that God created malaria, right? Or caused malaria to people or something like that. But though malaria is one of the things that's the existence of malaria and its terrible consequences are compatible with God and therefore not themselves, simply straightforwardly gratuitous, though we can come back to that point. It might be that nevertheless the theist could have a good reason for thinking, but God's not going to subject people to 3,500 years of fiery hell before entering heaven, because those things would violate deontic constraints, and God won't do that. And similarly for some of the other things, right? So that's one thing to note. And maybe I can put the point more broadly this way, that I don't take it to be a consequence. You can press it on me, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't take it to be a consequence of my own skeptical theistic impulses that it means that I can't know anything at all about what God might do. It's just that when you ask the question, how likely is it that I would know what God's reasons are in some domain that I haven't thought about it all yet? I think the thing to do is to shrug my shoulders. But I might get good reasons for thinking, for example, well, God wouldn't torture babies for fun. Or I might think I can get good reasons for thinking God wouldn't lie to us, right? And I could get those even though when you asked, well, would God allow X or Y or Z? I don't know. I don't know where that fits into the whole thing. And that, I think there's a way of being epistemically humble without opening the door to every damn thing. Again, this is controversial, but that's what I'm inclined to think. So when I hear the Pandora's box story, my impulse is to say, well, I don't think that merely in virtue of being in doubt about the no-seum inferences that are like at the heart, on my view, of almost all the evidential arguments, I don't think that in being in doubt about those, that entails I can know nothing about what God might do.
Okay, so I'd make a few points. So one of them is that, like, so if we imagine that just prior to looking at the universe, we're talking about we say, okay, God's going to create this perfect universe, and one of two things is going to happen. Either A, it'll have, small children getting cancer, the vast majority of sentient beings dying at a very young age, just forest, fires burning to death, old ladies, etc. Just all the terrible evils in the world. And then you say option two.
Yeah, I'm not laughing. You picked a funny one.
Yeah. And you say, and option two is that God will lie to people sometimes. And you ask, which one do we think is more probable? Well, I think that we would say that option two is way more probable. And so if that's true, then it seems like we would expect that, God lying to us, if we see that God brings about all these terrible things, then it seems like we would expect, it would be very hard to rule out God lying to us, just for sort of similar reasons.
One thing to note here is that maybe I misunderstood the point earlier. What I think God can't do is things that are morally unjustified. So are there any morally justified lies? Well, I'm tempted to think there are myself. I'm not a Kantian about lying. So I think that there can be some morally justified lies. So I think I don't have a problem with thinking that God could lie to me about some things if the moral circumstances justified it. It's a little hard to cook up the case in which God needs to lie to me but it's not going to bother me, right? I'm not going to be like, oh my God, it's inconsistent with the character of God. But yeah.
Well, actually, this sort of reminds me of an interesting point made by David Friedman. And David Friedman's an atheist, but so he said that one thing God might do is God might lie to people about hell. So if God wants people to, enter heaven, he may say that if they don't worship him, then they'll have to undergo hell. And so that is one plausible story.
Good. And notice that and the question there about moral justification, look, that would actually work pretty well on your moral outlook, right? Because if you think that the grounds are essentially consequentialist and you're going to get that maximum good consequence, that might be morally justified in that moral story. Since I'm not a consequentialist in that regard, it's a little trickier for me, but I like the point, right? That's how it could go, right? If you had to, right. but can I back you up? I mean, one thing about the way you set that little problem up, and maybe this was not essential to the story, but I was thinking it was that you started by imagining that God is going to make a universe and he's picking between them. And the way you put it was he's going to make a perfect universe. And then you compare these worlds. And I do wonder, Matthew, if part of what distinguishes our two different kind of outlooks about the distribution of suffering and other shit in the universe has to do with the degree to which antecedently we imagine that what a perfect being would have to do is at least attempt a perfect universe. And I'm not very attracted to that view. So I'm tempted by the view that not only needn't God make the best world, but that God could have good reasons for making a decidedly less than the best world. And so the idea that the world turns out to be less than the best, less than perfect, have various aspects to it that suck, in itself doesn't strike me as inconsistent with a perfect being. But a lot of it has to do with what you think God's purposes would be, right? Like, and
Sure.
you know, given, and this is just, I want you to see that, like, I'm not you, I want everyone. I want to see. I'm not teaching you. I'm just taking note of this. That if you have the hedonic view, right, then I see how it makes sense that you would expect a being to make a hedonic paradise. I mean, I think there are limitations on that. There might be some limitations on that too, but it gets there pretty quickly. But if you have a different moral view and you have a kind of developmental conception of what human beings are, the purposes that God has in creatures undergoing the transformations that human beings have to undergo, you might think, well, no, the world that God, a perfect being, would make wouldn't be a hedonic paradise. It would be something that allowed for various forms of moral development, etc. And then, you can see that this is just on the nub of the soul making stuff. So
yeah, so we could talk about utilitarianism, but I think that the arguments for utilitarianism, I think, are much less good than the arguments for the problem of evil. I've written like several hundred pages arguing for utilitarianism. One of my primary arguments for it is that if we just think about a variety of diverse cases, even when it seems wrong at first, it gets the right answer. But that is a thesis that requires hundreds of pages to bear out in any detail. So, right. Okay. In terms of the Pandora's box objection, so if we think that God has deontic constraints, then it seems like it would similarly, it seems like creating a world such that with conditions such that that your actions will have the predictable effect of bringing about malaria, which kills thousands of children. It seems like that would be a rights violation. I mean, even if it'll be billions of years before that happens, if you predict that your your action will bring about an effect that will kill thousands of children every day, that seems like a rights violation. And it seems like, if we think that there are deontic constraints on what God would do, it seems like it's hard to give an account that we can be very confident in that wouldn't rule out the instances of evil that I've discussed, but that would rule out God causing us to undergo 20 minutes of horrendous torment and then entering heaven or something like that.
Yeah, good. So the little moral argument there about the malaria, I want to resist. Let me try by resisting it. First, by noting, look, when my wife and I decided to have a kid, we knew that he was going to suffer. Right? We knew if we brought him into this world, he was going to suffer. He was going to have. You could make predictions about the particular kinds in some respects, but not in others. Some you don't see coming, some or heartbreak is among them. that, watching people he loves die is among them. That, vomiting is one of them. A bunch of things. It doesn't seem to me that there's any rights violation in my bringing him into the world, though, even under that knowledge, right? So why is it that you're tempted to think it's rights violating for God to bring about a world in which he knows that people will die of malaria?
Well, so I think that the reason for that would be that we don't think that it's a rights violation because it comes along with a package of other goods that we think are worth it. But if you had two options, option one is you could have your son who would, or not son, like your child who
he is a son. Yeah, fair enough. Yeah.
Okay. And everything would play out the way that it is. And he would vomit sometimes. Or option two, he would just never vomit. He would never have an upset stomach. Well, vomiting is a sufficiently small instance of evil that it's hard to say that's a rights violation. But it does seem like you would be doing something seriously morally wrong if you arbitrarily chose World 2 rather than World 1. So it seems like the relevant criteria is whether or not it comes as a necessary package with other things.
Good.
But I think I think that the evils that I talk about, like malaria, it's not clear why you couldn't bring about a world that's identical to this one, but just no malaria or no flesh-eating parasites. And if you think that there is some necessary connection between it and greater goods, well, then it seems like similarly, maybe there's some necessary connection between God causing everyone to undergo 20 minutes of agony before entering heaven and some greater good.
Yeah, good. Super nice. I don't have a hard time imagining myself that there are indeed greater goods or worse evils that that hang on the existence of malaria. Okay. Now, when you push me on, you don't think that about excruciating world. All I can say is, right, I mean, I think I can see some goods potentially contingent upon malaria, or at least contingent upon natural laws and human beings and biological organisms, such that if you're going to have those goods, the possibility of malaria and the possibility of malaria getting into people and the possibility of people discovering ways to stop malaria and the possibilities of people cooperating in such a way that they eliminate malaria and etc. Those, I think, I've got at least a vague grip on the way that could hang together as a package in a way I don't find myself seeing when I think about excruciating world. And so, but one of the things that's nice about the way this little conversation went is that it starts out with the thought that the permission of malaria might be a violation right, or I mean, a violation of a right. And then when we press, we say, well, in order for it to be a violation of a right, it would have to be that there was some pretty clear, better circumstance that God could have gotten. And then we're back to our original point, right? So I mean, I like the way that dialectic unfolds to kind of see that the kind of it does seem to me that in some respects the heart of the matter is that more fundamental one, and maybe it's. I mean, you maybe persuade me I'm wrong about this, but it can feel like it's good to see the nub, right? It's good to see I don't really think that the sort of worries about skeptical theism around the edges, like what strike me is around the edges, it might be morally stultifying, or we won't be able to argue for the existence of God if we're skeptical theists or what have you. Those really, when they get pressed, are going to come down to the nub of this point. The nub of the point is going to be something like, is it plausible to think that the form of epistemic humility that I started with is the right response to the actual suffering that the world contains as it is, or are we in something like something sufficiently like excruciating world that we should give up that? And just seeing that you and I both kind of have a pretty fundamental difference about the way things look to us from that point of view strikes me as extremely illuminating, right? I mean, it's when I say that's the nub of it, I don't mean, and so there it is, and there's no further work to do. I'm with you. For example, I think it probably turns out to a lot hangs on how good your arguments are. When we're at this nub, how good are your arguments for hedonic utilitarianism? How good are my arguments for deontic constraints? How good are your arguments that we oughtn't to be so modally skeptical? How good are my arguments that we ought to be modally skeptical? And there, I just want to note, like, I think it's a freaking tough call for anybody, right? It's like these are when you're at that level of sophistication. That's why I say, like, look, in the standard apologetics and counter apologetic stuff, people are scoring points and they're saying shit like, I raised this point and he couldn't respond to it, so I win. And you and I know, come on, man, these things are too damn hard for that, right? Like, you're striking me as an extremely sensible person, Matthew, who's weighing the things on the other side of this issue, just on the other side of it in some respects. And my judgment of that is, that's not crazy. I'm leaning this way on this side for these reasons, but I think that's the knife's edge we really live on with respect to things that are this hard.
Well, I appreciate that. I think so. One point that I think would perhaps be slightly better of an analogy. So, like, we know that whales don't get cancer very much.
Is that right? That's a good fact. Okay.
I actually read an article that was talking about this, and it said one of the theories for why they don't get cancer is that cancer comes when, like, an entity is sufficiently large that, or sorry, when from, like, cell replications working in the wrong way. But whales are so big that the cancers start to malfunction. And so the cancers get cancer and die, essentially, was the explanation. It's very speculative. But it seems like God could
find cancer cells in whales at some point. They never get going well enough to.
Right. Yeah, because whales are just so big. But I mean, that was pretty speculative. But it seems like God could make it so that we didn't get cancer, for example. That doesn't require any, like, I mean, that seems like as sensible of a modal claim as sort of intuitive and obvious of a modal claim as the claim that, like, I could have eaten something different for breakfast this morning. Putting aside determinism questions.
I'll give you that for now.
Yeah. And so I think that
really
the type of modal skepticism that would be required is a pretty extreme form of modal skepticism if we think that it is sufficiently decisive to rule out thinking that God could have made a world that was just like this one, but no cancer, for example. Or, similar thing could be done with other diseases.
But I mean, like, just to press it, I the reason it doesn't strike me as like you could have had something else, or, my judgment that I'm able to catch this pen if I throw it 2 feet in the air. Like, that's a more modal judgment that I'm totally confident in. Why is this one not like that? I mean, in order for find out everything we can about why the whales don't get cancer, and let's suppose that something on the order of the hypothesis that you're both taking from someone and maybe ramping up a little is right. And now you say, well, God could have just made us like that. And you think, well, but okay,
sorry, that would have required God making us much larger to do it exactly the same way that whales do. But it seems like God could find another way of achieving a similar purpose without us having to be much larger.
Good. I just want to say, maybe, I'm not denying that it's impossible. I'm just saying part of what it would mean when you start thinking about it, then it's things like, well, there would have had to been, it looks like, a different way of transmitting genetic structures to us than the ones that actually occurred. And that means, there would have had to been some differences in the whole history of evolution getting us to this place. And then I think when I start thinking about those things, then that's when I'm like, wait, I see what you mean. It seems like such an easy fix. Just don't let our cells do this. But then when you start thinking about what it means for ourselves or for ourselves to do this thing, in the case maybe of the Wells, where they defeat themselves. But look, I don't know enough about the biology myself, but even if we had the expert in the biology who said, well, what it would take is for the cells to act in this way. And then you said, okay, and what would our evolutionary history have had to been like for us to be like that? And you start tracing that back. Now it's the whole thing's implicated in ways. It's like, I don't think I should be very good at, I don't think I should have a lot of confidence on my judgments about things like that. That seems to be very different from whether or not I could have had something different for breakfast.
Sure, but an omnipotent God can, it seems like an omnipotent God has avenues that are not available to us. And so,
That's
well,
yeah.
Well, I would be unable to sort of figure out a way of like making our genes different such that we didn't get cancer. It seems like an omnipotent God would be able to do it. And you might say, okay, but that would have affected the history of the human race so much, it would produce all these unintended consequences, sort of butterfly effect-esque, in ways that would have sort of significant downsides, perhaps. But that seems to, but so if that's true, then it seems like that if we expect that all of the things that seem bad at first are ultimately good, ultimately make the world better, they have some morally sufficient purpose, ripple effect years down the line, then it seems like that would make it so that we shouldn't, in general, shouldn't get rid of bad things like malaria. Because maybe malaria has some morally sufficient purpose that ripples down the line and that prevents some greater evil.
Good. I mean, I'll just note on this score, like, so my the kinds of things I'm thinking about with respect to the cancer case is that, you know, suppose someone said to me, hey, you know, if our genes were just a little bit different in X way, that would have permitted us to avoid cancers in exactly the way that whales do, we would have never developed brains that are capable of doing the things that our brains are. Someone says that to me who like really knows his or her shit about neurology and biology. I'd be like, okay, like that's among the possibilities that I can't rule out, right? And then so I just want to note, it's not quite like, I mean, I do think there's the butterfly effect point too, about like maybe it has all kinds of implications for the way the history of speciation occurs, and lots of other goods are dependent upon it. I was just thinking very specifically in my own mind about like just getting the creatures like us that God might want, creatures capable of a certain kind of high order thought. The fact that might depend on a certain kind of genetic structure and therefore a certain kind of Darwinian history to get it, that if it were tweaked in such a way as to get rid of the cancer, we'd lose these other things. That doesn't strike me. I'm obviously, I'm not, I hope you hear and your listeners hear, I'm not claiming that's how it is. I have no idea. That's why I shrug my shoulders. Now your follow-up point is, sorry, did I cut you off, Matthew?
No, go ahead.
Okay. So but then your follow-up point is, but if you take that seriously, then aren't you in the situation where you can't do anything about malaria or you can't stop cancer? And that doesn't seem to follow for me. I still can reason on the basis of the information that I have about a wide range of things. And, you know, as far as I can tell, to the best of my judgment about you know, whether or not I should try to end this person's cancer, I think I should. And should I pull this child out of the drowning pond? I think I have very good reason to stop suffering where I can and when it doesn't cost me anything more. And this looks to me to be one of those cases. Of course, it's possible I'm wrong about those things, right? It's possible that my stopping malaria in this case, or cancer in that case, or save the child I save is the next Hitler. I mean, those are things I can't rule out. But I don't think that the mere fact about my doubt about what modal consequences there might have been for cancer, for example, infects the reasonability of my future directed judgments about stopping this bad thing or that bad thing.
Okay, so I think that it's certainly possible that with any particular evil, that in the absence of that evil, you couldn't have gotten humans at all. It seems imminently, like, just given how many evils there are, it seems incredibly unlikely that for every single instance of evil, that it has a morally sufficient reason for its existence. And so I think that, okay, maybe we think cancer, like, could have been necessary for some development going back in time.
Or at least the possibility of it, right?
Right. But so it seems like if we accepted that, then if you had a button that you could press, and it would have made it so that cancer never existed in the first place. My intuition would be that you should press the button. And it seems like to go back in time and make it so that cancer had never been around. And it seems like
all you know is if you push this button, there'll be no more cancer.
Well, I'm about to add something else to the case. So it would go back in time, and it would make it so that there had never been cancer. And then you have God, who's omnipotent, try to figure out the best way of filling in for whatever goods, if any, came from cancer. In that case, it seems obvious that you should press the button. Maybe cancer ultimately serves some greater purpose, but it seems like God could fill that in some other way. But for God, that's the position that he's in for every single instance of evil in the world.
And you're taking seriously the idea that if you press the button, no matter what God does, like, you'll pass out of existence. You're not going to exist.
Sure. I mean, we can say that. Yeah, sure. I mean, we can say that it would make an alternative that you would go to heaven or something. Because whatever the purpose is, God's figuring out some other way of filling it in. And so if there was some great importance of the particular assemblage of people who currently exist, well, maybe God could create them, could create sort of the same people, but with slightly different genes or something. So or something like that. But just whatever downside there are, God does his best to make them up, and he is omnipotent after all.
So just to make sure I see the case, I'm not sure we're going to be able to do much more than just get the case out here, okay? But the case is God exists. You believe that God exists. You believe that God has ordered this world for whatever God's reasons are, but because God is who God is, you think that there's some good reason for it. But then you're offered the chance to push a button that will go back in time, eliminate all cancer, and you're going to entrust God to tidy things up after the fact. And you think you're obligated to push that button, or you would push it.
Yeah.
I'll just report that if that's the setup, I don't have that judgment, and you can see why. It's because I'll be thinking something like this: shit, I don't know what the good reason is that God has allowed cancer in the world, but it would be my guess is that cancer is a sufficient enough bad that there was a pretty dangerous reason looming for God to have allowed it. So I think I'd be rolling the dice in a really dangerous way to press the button, given that God allowed it in the first place. So yeah, I myself wouldn't be. Do I want there to have been no cancer? Yes, of course I want there to have been no cancer, but I want there to have been no cancer and all of the goods that the world actually contains. And what I'm in doubt about is that both of those things can occur. I don't know about that. You seem like you have much more confidence that whatever it is, God could have worked it out, and it'll be. But my judgment is, well, if I think God exists, and in your story you're thinking God exists, shouldn't you be thinking, look, I don't know what the good reason is, but
sorry, just to be clear, the story doesn't stipulate that you think God exists. It stipulates.
Okay.
So it stipulates either that. So if God already exists, then there's no problem, and if God doesn't exist, then God appears, fills in for whatever the purpose is for cancer, and then disappears.
Okay.
So
I see.
So just to be clear, I agree that it would follow from your position that you should not press the button.
Yeah.
But my view is that it seems like it's just such an intuitive principle that if you could press a button that would make it so that no person ever got cancer, and then whatever purposes cancer is filling, you have an omnipotent being try to figure out the best way of doing it in some other way. It seems intuitive. Well, it seems like you should definitely do that for cancer. But even if you say that you shouldn't do it for cancer, it seems like there's at least one evil in the world for which you should do that. And yet it seems like your position convinces you to denying that there is even one evil for which you should do that.
That I don't think is right. Yeah, the last bit, yeah. I like your case now that I see it more now. I mean, I think it's, you can see that the judgments are a long ways from ordinary life. And so you can see that I'm going to kick in with a little bit of my skepticism about that. Because for you, it's clear you should push the button. And I think it's not so clear. But now you want to say, and don't you have to think that you shouldn't push the button for any evil? And that I think isn't obviously true. So if I could just stop individual ones, that doesn't strike me as so obviously problematic, right? Undoing all of the cancer, the worry I have is about the repercussions of that across the board. But are there some evils that I think it would make sense for me to eliminate? Yes. After all, I think of myself as someone who's working to stop injustice in the world presently. And so I want various evils to cease, and I want to try to get them to cease. And, presumably I try to help people so that certain evils like ignorance, at least in my job, I think, certain kind of ignorance is an evil, and I'm trying to stop that in my teaching. So I think I can do those things. And maybe this is a way to, as we're coming to a close, let me say this. We've been thinking about a sort of approach to the problem, especially the evidential problem of evil, where we've been thinking about it largely in its skeptical form, and which has been good. It's been very fruitful to me to think it through with you on this score. But let me add that I can be attracted. So Peter Van Inwagen has this slightly more positive case about that I'm inclined to accept. I think I was inclined to accept before I saw it, and then saw it that, yeah, that's probably my view. And that's that, as I think I'm an open theist, so I think that I'm inclined to think that if God exists, that God has left the future metaphysically open, in the sense that there are things that occur that that not even an omnipotent being could know for sure would occur. A lot of them have to do with human free will, but some of them have to do with subatomic indeterminacies and objective chanciness in the world. So I think God can have made the world objectively chancy. So one thing to note about that is that I probably have to allow that there could be some gratuitous evils in the world, even though it's overseen by God, because there could be some evils that God lets into the world by virtue of letting the future be genuinely open. And there's nothing that morally justifies that particular instance. There is a meta justification. That is, there's the justification for allowing the world to have an open future. And if God allows the world to have an open future, then shit like this sometimes happens, and for no reason at all. The answer to the question, why did this horrible thing happen to the person, is just things like that happen in a world that has basic indeterminacies built into it. And my own view is that goes some distance. That actually helps the problem of evil in some regard. You might not think that, but that's my temptation to think. And part of the reason I want to bring it out is because there is a way in which, if there are any evils like that, and someone says those are gratuitous, I'm not going to resist you. They are gratuitous, but I think they're compatible with the existence of an omni God, nevertheless.
Sure. So you mentioned that you had to sort of get going soon. So just one last point I would make. So I understand in the context of free will why that would be the case.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure that I understand why God would make there be objective chanciness, like subatomic chanciness, in ways that bring about gratuitous evil. It seems like God could make it so that there was not objective chanciness in ways that would avoid gratuitous evil.
Well, one thing I can't be sure of is that a world here we're going to get skeptical again. One thing I can't be sure of is that a world could contain free will of the kind I have in mind that wasn't also ordered by objective chanciness in that way. So it may be that having the laws of nature have that play in it is an essential feature of creatures like us being able to exercise genuine free will. That's one of the possibilities.
But couldn't you have genuine chanciness in psychophysical laws, but not genuine chanciness about subatomic particles?
Maybe. Yeah, that's one of the possibilities. I don't know. I mean, at least it strikes me as epistemically possible. Is it metaphysically possible? Well, we'll be back on that nub, right? We'll be back on the, well, how should I trust my modal judgments about things like that? I don't really know. And then I suppose I'll just add then that, another feature of the Van Inwagian defense there, which I think is not implausible, is that God could have a reason for letting merely chancy things happen, even bad things that happen because of indeterminacies at the subatomic level. And the reason might be something like this. It's actually very important. If you take something like the broad Christian story at all seriously, I'm not urging you to, I'm just conditionally, then God is trying to win humanity back to God's self. Things have gone wrong with humanity in some fairly serious way. Different theorists are going to have different views about how that wrongness goes, but nevertheless, most Christian theists will think something like things have gone wrong with human beings and their relationship to God and each other. And then, according to the Christian story, there's a kind of rescue mission at work, right? God's trying to redeem this stuff. And then here comes the explanation, that the reason why God might want there to be objective chanciness and consequent shitty things. It's because, possibly, this is just epistemically possible, right? Recognizing that we are subject to these vulnerabilities is a way for us to see our fundamental need to get our shit together and to return to the lover of our souls, return to the great shepherd of the sheep. And so there's a kind of a fundamental way in which, on the Van Inwagian story, which again I think is not epistemically implausible, or not epistemically crazy at least, why are there times when things happen and there's no good reason for them? That's how it is when you live to yourself. That's how it is when you've cut yourself off from God. And how else would you be motivated to be brought back to God but to see, you know what, this kind of sucks. This isn't great. I think I would like things if they were better than this. I think I would like a world in which children didn't get cancer. And I would like a world in which, bricks don't just fall off of buildings and land on people for no reason whatsoever. But how would I be motivated to return if there were no such things? So at least it's epistemically possible that one of the explanations for why there are subatomic and then consequences of subatomic openness is it makes possible that kind of thing.
All right. This seems like a good place to wrap up. Thanks so much for coming on. I think it's been a very good chat, and thanks for watching, everyone.
Thank you.